Hi everyone, my name is Christina and I'm the Family Programs Coordinator from the Vancouver Art Gallery. And this is Celia. Hey Celia, how you doing?
Hi everyone.
How's everybody else doing? Thank you so much for joining us here today. And welcome to Art at Home Live. So Celia and I have the very cool jobs of looking at art and talking to people about artworks. And of course, the best way to look at art is when you're in the art gallery, you can look right up close at the paint. You can walk all the way around the sculptures, but when you're ready to look at art in the gallery, you can check out the website and pre-book your tickets. But as for right now, thank you so much for joining us here in conversation on Zoom. Speaking of Zoom, has everybody used Zoom before? Let's take a quick look at how Zoom works. So, if we take a look at this picture, can you see it's circled in the next picture. There's a little button on your screen that says chat. There it is, it's circled in green here in this image. And if you click on chat, you can answer questions, you can bring up your own questions, your own suggestions and ideas, or you can even click on it right now and say hello to everyone who's joining us. Hello, oh, everyone is already. Hello, hello Jody. So today, we are going to talk about an artist who combines her Coast Salish cultural knowledge with her own unique vision and creates incredible works that we can see all over the city of Vancouver. Her name is Susan Point. She's a carver, printmaker, and jewelry maker, to name just a few of the ways that she creates. So now we see everyone coming in saying hello, hello, welcome. We're so glad that you're all here taking your time with us today to learn and think along with Susan Point. So Susan Point says, as an artist, I've been very fortunate to draw upon the rich legacy of traditional visual language. My Salish ancestors bestowed on their future generations the gift of a powerful culture rooted in teaching of respect for all life, passed down through an oral tradition supported by a diverse visual treasure of art. So in this session, we are going to learn about the incredible life and work of Susan Point. We're going to learn about design elements that are specific to Coast Salish cultures from a Coast Salish artist. And we're going to consider our own respect for and connections to nature and the cycles of life as well. And then at the end of the session, I'm going to show you how Susan Point inspired me to create a print with design elements that I made from my own imagination that kind of represent and express cycles of life and my own connection to nature. And I'm going to explain how you can too. And I'm not a Coast Salish person, so I will not be talking about Coast Salish cultural practices, as they're not mine to share. Susan Point's powerful story is one that should be told by the artist herself. So what I am going to do is share Susan Point's voice from interviews, from videos, publications, as a way for us all to learn more and more about her work. So I'm excited to look at and think about Susan Point's work along with you. Dylan is excited, everyone's saying hello. I think we're all getting pretty excited. Thank you for being here with us. So in an interview, when Susan Point describes carving cedar, she says, the calmness and serenity of working on a piece was so enjoyable. So I'm going to ask you all, have you ever had that experience of calmness and serenity when working on an artwork? You can describe it in the chat if you like. Celia, have you ever had that experience of kind of a calmness and a serenity while working on, serenity meaning like a peace of mind while working on an artwork? What do you think?
Yeah, come to think of it, yes, I do some design work, and when I get into this sort of, I call it a zone, when it's just like a creative flow for me. Yeah. And
I love that idea. Kind of getting in the zone, getting into that flow. And Dylan is saying all the time you have that experience. Fantastic. So you can kind of relate that to how Susan Point is describing working with cedar. So you know what? I think we should hear from Susan Point herself in a video. I'm going to stop my video and we're going to have Susan Point introduce her ideas and inspirations.
I tried to show the connection between all things because they are all connected. And a good example is the enduring spirits. It's a cycle of life. No, it goes in a circle. It's the web of life. You have bears dragging the salmon onto the forest floor, and they leave scraps. Then it's picked up by the roots of the tree, and it goes into the tree, and then the birds come, you know, and they eat whatever it is, the pine cones or berries or whatever. And, you know, it's a circle, it just keeps going. I've always been interested in art, right from childhood. And it wasn't until later in life that I discovered I had my own art form, the Coast Salish art style. My greatest influences would be my mother, who told me a lot of legends and stories when she was young, and also my Uncle Dominic Point, who also told me various legends. And my uncle, Dr. Michael Chu as well, who was the professor out at UBC at the time and specialized in Coast Salish art and culture. I like to do public art because I like the public to understand what our art form is. And, you know, it gives everyone a chance to see the piece as opposed to doing work for private clients. I believe you can't make an artist an artist. You know, it's inbred within you. To leave behind all of this is something for my grandchildren to carry on in the future. That's what I hope.
I always love seeing an artist in process. I loved seeing Susan's tools that she was using as she was carving and how she explained the importance of connection to all things in circles of life. I noticed a few people raised their hand as well. You can type questions into the chat. And if you had any trouble seeing that last video, I'm just gonna put the link in the chat right now that you can check it out yourself on your own browser. So Susan Point, she was born in Alert Bay, BC, while her parents, Edna Grant Point and Anthony Point, were on a fishing trip. She describes herself as a contemporary artist of Coast Salish heritage. Contemporary art is art that's being made now, or like recently in the past 20 years. So then if we think of contemporary artists, it means that artists who are working now, or recently, like in the past 20 years. So let's take a minute to think about what Coast Salish means. The Coast Salish people are indigenous to the lower mainland of Vancouver, the southern tip of Vancouver Island, and the northern areas of Washington State and the United States. There are many indigenous communities and cultures within Coast Salish territory. So I said the word indigenous. Do you know what the word indigenous means? What does everybody think? What does the word indigenous mean? Indigenous, it means the first people to live in what is now referred to as Canada. And Jody's saying from here, and Margaret also messaged congratulations to Susan's son for his new installation at UBC. And I know that her son Thomas also has an installation at UBC that was done for the Olympics. Wonderful. So did you know that the Vancouver Art Gallery, where Celia and I work, is on Indigenous land? It's on the land of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. These nations are part of the Coast Salish people, and Susan Point is a member of the Musqueam community. And if you want to learn about the land that you live and play on, there's this great app called Whose Land. I'm going to type the link into the chat right now. And you can check it out. Oh, there's the Vimeo link. And that's just for Whose Land here. It actually is a great tool, and it'll tell you more about the history of the land that you are working and playing on right now. Musqueam people traditionally speak a language called Hunkamanam. Did you know that the plaza outside of the Vancouver Art Gallery, it was renamed in Hunkamanam as well as a Squamish name? So let's listen to Gabrielle George, Kiselium, and Elder Larry David to help us learn how to pronounce these words and why acknowledging language is so important. I'm going to turn off my video and listen.
The name in Hunkamanam is Tlanak.
The name is Tlaunk.
Tlaunk in Hunkamanam, it means a place to have gatherings, to have ceremony.
Tlaunk is a Squamish word that we've created for this square in the city of Vancouver. The meaning of the name is related to a place of cultural gathering.
Humathquium, Salewatot, and Tchotmish are part of the Coast Salish peoples, and our ceremonies and our gatherings were the places where many things were exchanged. Information about people's names and weddings would happen, but also things that took place in ceremony became our laws as well and became our truth.
The reason to, I think, to learn this word is to recognize that there is another language besides English and French that is here in the city of Vancouver. And it also gives recognition that people that live in different parts of the world will also endeavor to learn the language of the land. The name.
So it's important to learn about Musqueam culture from Musqueam people. And if you check out these wonderful educational resources, I'm going to put them in the chat right now. You can hear Musqueam voices and stories and learn about the Musqueam worldview. And I want to thank the protocol coordinator from Musqueam Band for giving us permission to share these fantastic resources. I'm just going to put them in the chat right now. You can see them on the screen, but sometimes it's easier just copy and paste from the chat. So we've been introduced to what Coast Salish means and the importance of the Hokumainum language. Let's take a closer look at some of Susan Point's artworks and find out what she is sharing about her Coast Salish culture through them. So Susan Point had an exhibition at the Vancouver Art Gallery in 2017, and she said that she wanted visitors to learn that Coast Salish art has its own beautiful visual language. When I say visual language, I mean so a communication of ideas or knowledge or history that's expressed in images. Susan Point said, I hope the imagery is interpreted as proud symbols of a living tradition. Let's take a look at some of her earliest works to better understand what she is sharing with us. First, let's look at this print together. Let's go back to the print for just a second. And then we're going to learn a little bit more about it. So, about this work, she said, I wanted to create an image that no one had seen before. So when we look at this, I'll ask you, everybody, and I'll ask you too, Celia, what is the first thing that you notice about this work? Take a second, you can describe your answers in the chat if you like. What's the first thing that you notice? What do you think, Celia? What do you notice?
Oh, I see. They look like fish, but some like a type of salmon to me, these ones here.
Aha! So Celia is noticing fish, but not just any fish, salmon, very interesting. Catherine says faces within the salmon. So interesting, we're already seeing images within images. So seeing faces, Every says circles, Sherry says circles. Oh, and Madison says seeing a lot of circles. Very interesting. Keep this theme in mind, everybody. We're going to be talking more and more about this as we go. So when she created this print, Susan Point was working as a secretary for the Alliance Tribal Council. She also began studying jewelry design at Vancouver Community College. She made time for herself at night to make art. During her maternity leave with her third child, she began making jewelry in a Northern Indigenous style, a Haida style. She would use her foot to rock her son Thomas in the cradle while she carved jewelry at the table. She says this rocking motion with her foot had kind of like a meditative or a calming effect and helped her carve patiently. Her son Thomas recalls, once mom came home from work after she had made the time to clean our rooms, vacuum the house, do our laundry, make dinner, she needed time for herself. This is when she made art. This was a talent that she had not worked on for many years. Thomas goes on to say, the kitchen table is the first place that mom made prints. Probably some of the earliest prints have remnants of dinner that day hiding in the paper somewhere. So, and like I mentioned before, Thomas grew up to be a carver, and he carved the work Thunder at UBC for the 2010 Olympics. And now I'm looking more at some of your responses to what you noticed. So they look like fish in a circle. So seeing circles, but also fish forming a circle. And faces. Oh, so Dylan's saying the faces in the fish could even be like a fish baby, which is an interesting idea because we're talking about, like what Susan Point said, the cycles of life, right? Growth and rebirth. Svetlana says the 4 directions. So seeing 4 salmon makes us think of a lot of different things. Fantastic. And all the salmon are circling, so motion in a circle. Aha, we're going to talk more about all of these things. You're really noticing a lot of great things about this work. So Point says that when you look at the salmon, for instance, you can draw it in so many ways, and there are so many ways you can work the elements into the salmon. It's taken me years just to research and understand Salish art. So, okay, let's think about what Coast Salish design means. So Susan Point describes that in my contemporary style, I always include the elements of the Coast Salish, which are the crescents, the wedges, the V-cuts, which are found within the art of Salish people. So these elements that we're going to learn about today are shared as a way to recognize and respect these very special and important shapes, designs, and ideas that are used by Coast Salish people. And we're going to learn a little bit about these design elements from a Coast Salish artist. His name is Sean Peterson, or Qualtius. He is a member of the Puyallup tribe, and he has been practicing art since 1996. He was very generous in giving us permission to show this incredible resource that he created. So I'm going to stop my video here, and let's take a look at Qualtius Sean Peterson's work.
The Coast Salish people live in the Pacific Northwest region of North America, in western Washington and southern British Columbia. The term Salish refers to a language family, and within those are several tribes. The basic design elements of Coast Salish art include circle, crescent, trigon, and extended crescent. Here in this historical photo, we see an example of a spindle whorl in use. It's comprised of two pieces, the whorl, or disc, and the spindle. The center of the whorl is pierced, and the spindle runs through it, which allows the weaver to create material for woven textiles. This gives some insight into how the design's characterized rhythmic movement may have developed. These objects were often carved with low relief designs, like the one you see here. Another concept often used is to imagine a calm body of water enclosed by two borders, then dropping a pebble in to create ripples that carry the elements away from the center. This animation of a simple pattern of cutout shapes relates to the pebble concept and also highlights the relationship of positive and negative. So the carved out areas are the negative, and the untouched surface is the positive. So if we were to transition into painted form to highlight the positive, say blue, blue would be the positive and white would be the negative space. The distribution.
So we're going to pause that there for a second. There's a lot of information in that video. Again, we're very thankful to be able to share it. I've also added a link to learn a little bit more about Sean Peterson's life and work and him telling his own story. But let's look at Susan Point's work again, now thinking about what we've learned from the video that we just watched. Okay, so do you see, let's think of these Coast Salish design elements. Take a look for those circles. You don't have to, everybody already noticed those circles, didn't you? But now let's look at those crescents that he mentioned. Do you see crescents in the image?
Mm-hmm.
And then also look for those trigons. Now, Celia, maybe you can point out some of these different shapes that you notice. I'm sure you can see where you see circles. Celia, where's one that really stands out to you?
Sure. I see lots of circles, one right in the center, but then the eyes, and then these ones on the little fins on each of the salmon, and more focus on the body. And then they form a big circle.
So we have circles within circles, just like someone else was noticing. Images within images. What about those crescents? Do you notice any of the crescents, Celia?
Oh, yes, for sure. There's these ones right here that look like a little smile on the side of their heads. And then the fish themselves look like a crescent or moon shape to me as well.
Ah, that's interesting. I never even thought of it. That's kind of interesting too. What about the trigon?
These trigons, I think I
Trigon.
see them right here on their on all of their tails.
Ha, it's kind of like a triangle. Helps me remember trigon. It has 3 different points. Sometimes they're much longer, like the one that we see in the image that Sean Peterson just showed us, and sometimes they're a bit shorter, like the one that Celia just showed us. Fantastic, thanks, Celia. So Susan Point, she researched the visual culture of her Coast Salish ancestors when she began creating her first prints using Coast Salish design elements. Madison just noticed that the fins look like waves. So that's interesting. Again, we're using kind of like waves, like action words to express the work and to express what we see in the work. So you obviously see some movement in the work. So Susan Point said, at the time that she created these prints, at the time there was very little to be found in terms of Coast Salish art. Regardless, I worked with all the materials I had collected. I essentially reflected on traditional imagery that I had researched in the archives at the Vancouver Public Library, at the National Library, as well as at various museums in Vancouver, Victoria, and Washington State. At the same time, however, I began creating and producing original contemporary jewelry and limited edition prints and painted many designs on deer hide drums. All the while, I continued my research, studying from slides and interviews. And Susan Sun said she worked very hard early on, studying every single Coast Salish artifact that she could see. She traveled to other cities and other countries just to study the artwork of her ancestors. So again, we can look for those Coast Salish design elements in another print that Susan Point did around the same time. So again, you can kind of look on your own, or you can also describe what you notice in the chat. If you see something different, you can look for those circles, you can look for those crescents, and you can look for the trigons. So I want to ask, does this print have anything in common with the last print that we looked at? What does everybody think? Does it have anything in common with the last print that we looked at? Isabel, notice the crescents are used to be the gills of the fish. Fantastic. Svetlana notices those same elements. So great. So you're looking for those Coast Salish design elements like we learned about. Madison noticed lots of circles as eyes. So then the faces in the fish, Ocean's noticing. Again, not just any fish. We're going to talk about that in a second. So in the video, it was also discussed about negative space. It can be kind of tricky to understand. So when I talk about negative space, it's the spaces in the artwork where the paper is showing through. So the white of the paper is actually creating a form or a shape. So if you look closely, there's actually another face within all of the kind of fish images that we see. Svetlana is saying the trigons are connected and form the eye of the second image. So I love that idea, seeing connections already, the connections of the beings together, thinking about interconnection, movement, circles of life. Isabel noticed it is similar. They are salmon and a circle, just like the first ones. So again, I'll just mention quickly, Celia, maybe you'll be able to point this out because I couldn't see it at first either. Do you see that face that's made out of negative space, that face that's created by using the white of the paper?
Yeah, I only saw it because I was looking for circles. So I see these circles on the salmon, but then this white space looks like a nose to me. And then this white space here, which is a circle, looks like a mouth. And
I also think, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and then there's 2 eyes, it looks like.
It's a great example of why we need to talk to each other when we look at art, because like I said, I didn't see the face at first. And sometimes what someone else sees, you can talk about and learn more and more from. So we've talked a few times about that this has in common with the other print is salmon. So salmon, Susan Point explains, are considered fortuitous to many First Nations, and in some cases, a key component of our way of life, whether gathering to celebrate and feast or to barter for essentials. She says, the animals that I've used, like the salmon, are very important in Coast Salish legends and the stories that were told years ago in the artistic works done by my ancestors. So let's compare two more prints that Susan Point created. The one on the left, the kind of teal blue color, is called Awakening, and it was made in 1993. And the one on the right is called Circle of Life and was made 11 years later in 2014. So we can think about, again, what do these two prints have in common? And we can look for those Coast Salish design elements. You can also think about if they remind you of the earlier prints that Susan Point worked on. Mary Jo noticed there's that circle in the middle of each. Again, bringing us back to the circle shape as a symbol. What else does everybody notice? What do they have in common? Well, I'm sure you're all looking for those design elements. You're looking for, like what Mary Jo noticed, the circles, you're looking for the trigons, and you're looking for those crescents. Madison noticed that they're fish again. Again, not just any fish, they're salmon. And Amy noticed, looks like eyes. Oh, I love that. I never saw that either. Again, that's why it's great to have your responses. Sherry notices a sense of movement. And Svetlana again notices the number 4. Okay, so seeing especially the work on the right, or sorry, the left, we see 4 salmon. Again, often 4 can represent, someone mentioned earlier, the 4 directions. We have 4 seasons. And Sherry noticed using negative space to create images. Aha, so Susan Point's designs, you can look at them for so long because as you look, more and more and more can emerge for you. So one other thing that these works have in common is they're both screen prints. I don't know if anyone has ever done screen printing before. Celia, have you done screen prints before?
Well, a long time ago, but I've also done lino prints.
Aha, so as you must know, Celia, creating any kind of prints, it means you have to be very, very careful and plan very carefully and be very precise. Susan Point's mother, Edna, was a weaver. And from her, Susan Point learned that you have to know where you want to end up before you start, which is very true of silk screen prints. You have to have that design and that stencil created before you even start to place the ink. So when Susan Point had her exhibition at the Vancouver Art Gallery in 2017, by then she had created 364 prints. And that was 3 years ago, so I can only imagine how many she's created by now. I think the best way to talk about screen printing is to show you a quick demonstration. I'm going to show you a clip of our friend Ben Duncan, who works at Malaspina Printmakers, which is a not-for-profit organization that specializes in printmakings as well as other practices. And I'm going to put the link to Malaspina in the chat for anyone who's interested in learning more and more. Turn off my video here. So you can see Ben is placing the paper underneath the screen. So the screen is what he's pulling down, and that's actually what holds the stencil. Here you can see he's placing ink on top of the screen, and then he's going to pull. So you can really see where the ink goes through the stencil there. And then you can create again and again. But we also have to consider, so that Susan Point's work have so many different layers. So she would have made a print and layered it again and made a print. I'm just gonna put the link, as I mentioned I would, to Malaspina into the chat here. And then I wanna talk a little bit about some of the other ways that Susan Point creates with different materials. So this is an artwork that was installed in that exhibition in 2017. Let's look up close to see what some of the different materials are. This work is an example of ways that Susan Point, turn my video back on here. This work is an example of ways that Susan Point adds her own style and experimentation to her knowledge of Coast Salish traditional design. It's a combination of 3 artworks created at different times, and it shows us how Susan Point is always reinventing and experimenting through her work. So if we look up close at this section, what does everybody think? What material do you think she's made this out of? I know it's hard to tell from an image. And I'm looking at the chat. Some people have said that they have tried to do lino or some other kind of silkscreen printing as well. Isabella notices wood. Barbara notices wood and glass, wood or clay. It kind of does look like it could be from clay. But you know what? It is absolutely wood. Not just any wood, it's wood, it's cedar. So it's wood from a cedar tree, which is a very important tree that sustains many indigenous communities and is important in many different ways. So what does this remind you of? Does it remind you of anything we've seen today, or maybe something from your imagination? What does it remind you of? Does it remind you of anything, Celia?
Well, we talked about spindles. Does that look like something? It's like circular, but it has a hole in it in the middle.
Someone else noticed the hole in the center of some of the other prints as well. And that's, again, referencing the spindle whorl like we saw in the video. So Barbara's noticing kind of rhythm and flow, ongoing life. I love that idea, that movement again we're seeing. Water drop creating ripples, Sherry said. I love that part of the video that shows that sense of a water drop moving outwards. And again, thinking of motion and movement and cycles. So Susan Point, as we mentioned, she started carving in wood in about 1993. And she said, I was hooked on carving. I loved working with the wood. The smell of the cedar while carving and seeing my art came to fruition was amazing. The calmness and serenity of working on a piece was so enjoyable. Since then, I've gone well beyond 2D panels to full 360 degrees monumental, that means gigantic 3D wood sculptures. And Yvette is asking, is this sculpture carved from one piece or are they different pieces put together? Oh, that's an excellent question, Yvette. I actually don't know the answer to that question. I have seen it in real life up close, and I would believe that it's from one piece, but I think that's a great thing for me to also look into again. And a great thing to think about as we look at some of her other carvings too. Always great to think about the artist process. How did the artist create that? So Susan Point, again, Celia was mentioning that spindle whorl, that disc with the hole in the middle. And Susan Point describes the spindle whorl as a disc which acted as a flywheel in the spinning device used for making wool yarn. The circular spindle whorl format is representative of the circle of life. Many of the ancient spindle whorl motifs that originally inspired me to practice Coast Salish art were very graphic and in some cases geometric in nature. Although I initially started studying and drawing the old worlds with human and animal forms on them, I've always admired the ones with simply geometric and floral imagery. And I love how we talked about the motion and movement in this work that you already noticed. Let's look at the other pieces of this artwork. So what do you think this part of the artwork is made out of? This one's a little bit trickier. What do you think this part could be made out of? Glass. Yeah, Isabel mentioned it looks like glass. It's absolutely made out of glass. Have you ever seen glass that is shaped like this and formed? Barbara's noticing etched glass. It is etched. It's actually etched by a process called like sand carving or sand blasting. And everyone is wavy glass. Madison's noticing, and Rachel notices glass as well. So Susan Point, she was the artist in residence in 2002 at the Pilchuck Glass School in Washington, where she learned ways to manipulate and change and melt and mold glass in different ways. Ocean says it kind of looks like it could be marble. So it could be a lot of different things, but it is, in this case, she's used glass. Susan Point said, in 1986, I ventured into a new medium, creating artwork in glass. At the time, this was a medium that local galleries would not accept. They said it was not native art because of my use of the glass medium, a non-traditional medium, which was not what native artists used. So I like, oh, Isabel noticed the shadow is very beautiful. It reminds me of an ocean. I love that you noticed the shadow of the work, whether Susan Point intended for the shadow to be cast that way or not, it really adds to movement and motion. And this work is actually called Salish weave. So we see that sense of movement and motion, but we also see how the different pieces of glass are weaving over top of each other. Again, reminding us of the importance of weaving in Coast Salish culture, just like the importance of the spindle whorl in creating yarn and wool to weave. So let's take a look at that one last section Oh, and Margaret, I'm just noticing here, is asking, or has paint been added to the background? No, that was just a shadow, Margaret. Good question, though. Sometimes images, this is why it's great to go and see artwork in real life, but sometimes images can be deceiving. It looked like paint, but it was actually a shadow. So if we look at this section, what does everybody think? What does it remind you of? And do you see those Coast Salish design elements? What do you think? This one looks like a whale in water, Isabel noticed. Aha, and Margaret says an orca. Ocean's noticing a whale as well. Madison said it looks like soap. Madison, you have very interesting soap. And Rachel's noticing an orca as well. So do you know what? This work is actually, this part of the work is called Orca Pod. It was made much earlier, 1997, I believe. And it's actually, it's an orca, right? It's not just any whale, just like the salmon aren't just any fish. Orcas live in Coast Salish territory. And Celia notices that sense of water again. So not just the orca, the water. And again, you can look for those Coast Salish elements of the circles and the trigons and the crescents. So Susan Point says, when I design and work on a piece, regardless of medium, there are countless stories, thoughts, and memories that go through my mind. I'm redesigning the artwork all the time to challenge myself and to experiment and express my ways of being original. So let's look at the different materials of another artwork that represent part of Susan Point's life experience. Let's look up close. Yeah, thank you, Celia. Let's look up close to talk about the powerful meaning behind this work. So, Ocean notices too, you see an orca and blue glass looks like water and the circle is a fin while talking about the last artwork. So again, you're seeing all those natural elements coming together. And if we turn our focus to this artwork, you can kind of think within yourself, what are the different parts that you notice? Are there any parts that you recognize that we've spoken about earlier in the session? Susan Point says that this piece is a symbol of power for those of us who had the strength and resilience and survived the residential school system. Resilience means the ability to stay strong and keep going in the face of extremely difficult things. Susan Point says, unfortunately, it represents the disconnection from the wisdom and teachings I lost as a child, as well as our Hokumenum language. When she was 9 years old, Susan Point was forced to leave her family and go to a residential school. These were schools that would not let her learn about her own Musqueam Coast Salish culture or speak her own Hokumenum language. These schools actually wanted her and thousands of Indigenous children to forget about her family's culture and language altogether. There were 139 residential schools in Canada that tried to remove Indigenous ways of life and culture from Indigenous people from the mid-1800s till 1996. So the last residential school closed less than 25 years ago. So what I'm going to do is put a link for some resources in the chat for you to talk about. You can look at these resources to talk about the impacts of the residential school system together as a family with care. It's very important that is ongoing conversations. I'm also going to add the link to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation so you can continue that learning and these conversations about these truths of history together with care as a family. And feel free if anyone has any other questions or comments. We're noticing different parts of the work. I'm going to put those links into the chat. Let's look up close at one more section of the work. Oh, I'm just going to, those links didn't work. I'm just going to change my settings there and make sure that everyone can see them because they're very important and helpful resources that were created with care. So if we look up close, what do these shapes remind you of or make you think about if we go back to that last slide? So Madison said it kind of reminds you of owls. So still thinking about animals, of course. What does everybody else think? So Isabel reminds you of eagles. It's an important animal to Susan Point as well. And Celia reminds you of feathers. The squares, Ocean's saying the squares inside of the circles look like eyes. Barbara's noticing hummingbirds. Melissa's noticing some salmon as well. We see that theme of salmon. Dawn reminds you of trillium flowers. Aha, a lot of people are saying flowers. We also have a lot of people saying eagles. Well, Susan Point says that the beautiful imagery within each grid is made up of butterfly wings overlapping each other in a circular format that represents the cycle of life and close connection of my people upon this land. On the wings of the butterflies are designs in my contemporary art style depicting salmon, eagles, and ravens, Coast Salish imagery that was taken from me as a child. So let's take a look at other ways that Susan Point creates symbols of power, expressing her culture's proud living tradition and resilience. And this is another print called Salish Vision that was created in 2011. So let's look very closely at this incredible design for animals that are important to Susan Point as they represent that connection to Musqueam territory. So look closely at this design. What do you see? We see, Isabel says eagles and a frog. Margaret notices a frog. What does everybody else notice? This is one of those works that you have to look really closely at for a long time. Ocean noticed the bottom half looks like a frog. I definitely see that frog as well. And Isabel mentioned, right, eagles again. Mary Jo notices a pelican. And Madison sees turtles. Well, you know what? Susan Point said, in all of my pieces, I create work so that universally, anyone at any age can form their own opinions, assumptions, and interpretations. Therefore, as a contemporary artist of Coast Salish descent, many of my works do not have stories behind them as pieces change all the time, as they should for the viewer. So I'm saying that because all of your responses are all very different and interesting, and Susan Point wants us to bring our imagination as we look at her works. Ocean's noticing the circles in the middle of the circles, and people are mentioning more animals, 2 salmon, a crow, and a frog. Do you also see how the animals are interconnected? They're connected to each other. So look for an area where maybe one part of one animal is turning into the other part of one animal. When I say that, I'm thinking of how the frog that everybody noticed at the bottom, it looks like the frog's legs are kind of turning into the salmon's mouths, and the salmon is transforming into what looks like wings. Catherine noticed lots of symmetry, absolutely lots of symmetry. So each side is balanced and alike in this particular work. So let's take a second. We noticed the frogs, we noticed the salmon. Ocean is saying the crescent in front of the frog looks like a smile. So it looks like a smiling frog. Well, that's interesting too, the way that shapes remind us of symbols of emotions and things like that. So if you see, again, Isabel, you agree with that, with Ocean as well? So the other animal that is present here it's a creature called the thunderbird. And Susan Point describes a thunderbird as a protective figure. She says, I have attempted to honor some of the unique expressions of the thunderbird in a series of images that reflect the ancestral artistic diversity of my people. These images are original interpretations inspired by motifs found on old pieces, spindle whorls, mat creasers, petroglyphs, etc. that I have researched. Although original in design, they reflect traditional formats explored long ago by Salish artists who profoundly depicted the legends and stories about the thunderbird in their own unique and individual style. I hope these are images interpreted as proud symbols of a living tradition. Let's take a look at one of Susan Point's favorite animals. Now, can you tell what animal she's showing us in this work? This is, again, a screen print that was created in collaboration with her daughter, Kelly Canal, in 2005. It's called Memory. So Isabel, you notice the frog. What does everybody else see? Madison sees fish. And Brian notices a tadpole. So not just a frog, we see tadpoles and frogs. So again, we're thinking about that sense of growth, of birth, and of life cycles that Susan Point is showing us here. So I want to use Susan Point's words to describe why she loves creating designs to celebrate frogs. She says, I have a deep and total respect for the life of the frog, which is an important part of my culture, as told to me many times by my mother, as she learned from the elders of her time. She says, prior to European contact, throughout most of the year, my people, the Coast Salish, lived outdoors, hunting and fishing in the spring and gathering berries, shellfish, and cattails in the summer. Towards the end of November, as the days grew shorter, and when the frogs stopped singing, my people knew it was time to move back into their longhouses for the winter ceremony. During this time, they feasted and gave things away and continued to do so until all the food, clothing, baskets, and blanket giveaways were gone. Also, during these winter months, they would perform their spiritual dances. In February, when the frogs started singing again, ending the season of spiritual dancing, many people left their longhouses and returned to hunting and gathering. So that is why Susan Point feels that the frog is so special to her and to her culture. I'm just looking at the questions now in the chat. Margaret is wondering, I'm wondering whether because of the overall shape is circular, is this intended to support the symmetry, or like this image, could it be hung in a different orientation? Great question. I'm not sure what the answer is. It's circular, so it's almost like maybe it doesn't matter what way that it's hung because it's always kind of in motion and movement. And we do see that symmetry again. Can everyone notice that? That we don't just have the two sides that are the same, like in the last work that we looked at, we have those four kind of sections that the same. And Isabel is saying a lot of her prints remind me of kaleidoscopes. I like that observation, Isabel, so that sense of seeing an image, but again and again and again in different forms. And Catherine's saying it makes me think of a life cycle from the center out. We have that egg, then the tadpole, then the frog. I love that, Catherine. So let's take a look at, we're going to compare this to another artwork. Thank you all for your fantastic ideas. Okay. Let's compare these two artworks. What is the same about them? And we can also think about, what is different? What is the same and what is different? Let's think about what they're made out of. So the last one we just looked at, we know it's a screen print. Madison notices one has color. Aha, Macy sees the frog legs. Just looking through all of these comments to make sure I don't miss any. We saw that life cycle. One is in 3D and one is in 2D. That's a really good observation, Dylan. When we say 3D, we mean something that could be like carved or has different depths and different levels. Well, we know that the tadpole, the first one with color, is a print. So it is flat, it's 2D, and it's on paper. Great observation again. So now what we're gonna do, I wanna describe, has anybody seen this, by the way? Does anybody recognize the one on the right? I've never seen it before. Just making sure I don't miss anything in the chat here. The one on the right is cast metal, Barbara noticed. Absolutely, Barbara said it looks like a sewer cover. Someone noticed, Ocean said one of them looks like it's made out of rock. Interesting. One is a carving, but doesn't look like out of wood. Aha, well, many of you are absolutely right. The one on the left has more detail, Ocean is noticing, so we can see really the more clear kind of representation of the tadpole or frog with colors. And someone said it's a sewer plate. Kate just said it's a manhole cover if we look at the one on the right. Has anyone seen these before? So this is, of course, just like you noticed, this print has kind of been reimagined or created actually around the same time as there was a competition in 2004 in the city of Vancouver. It was called Art Underfoot and invited anyone who lived and worked or goes to school in Vancouver to submit designs for new manhole covers. So they received more than 640 entries. And in 2007, the winning design, which was this one by Susan Point in collaboration with her daughter Kelly, was selected and placed all over the streets of Vancouver. So Susan Point said, I like to do art because I like the public to understand what our art form is. It gives everyone a chance to see the work. So when you see one of these artworks, when you're walking around Vancouver, make sure to stop and share with everyone that you're with that this artwork is here to remind us of the vibrant living Coast Salish culture and that we're all living on Coast Salish land, those of us who are here in Vancouver. Let's look at one more public artwork and make sure I didn't miss any comments here. Okay. Does anybody recognize these works? Have you ever seen them? They're called Salish welcome figures. Maybe you can think about where you may have seen them. Aha, Macy noticed at the airport. Has anyone else been to the Vancouver airport and seen these figures? So these are carvings by Susan Point, and the curator of her exhibition, the curator is the person who organizes the exhibition, he says that these works are here so travelers from abroad pass between the figures as they enter Canada Customs Hall and Vancouver International Airport, which is on unceded Musqueam territory. And upon entering the hall, the travelers encounter a pair of human figures, a male with fishers or mink on the left, if everyone can see that, and a female with eagles on her chest on the right, deeply carved from red cedar, again cedar, in a manner based closely to the traditional house posts once found in the interiors of Coast Salish longhouses. And you can't see it in this image, but on the other side, there's also a carving of human figures with hands up as a traditional welcoming gesture. And Isabel is saying that, yes, you have seen them before, and that there is a lot of Indigenous art at the Vancouver International Airport, a lot of art made by Susan Point. Some of them we saw in the video that Sean Peterson created. And Dylan noticed, I've seen the other one, but the spindle shape. So we saw that briefly in the video, that big round, it's huge. It's actually just when you walk past these works. Actually, no, it's on the other side, but it's that huge spindle shape, that big round carved circle with water passing behind it like a fountain. So let's look at one final Susan Point print that kind of expresses this continued experimentation with the Coast Salish elements. So if you take a look at this, you can think about, okay, what is Susan Point showing us here? You can look for those trigons, crescents. You can look for those circles. You can think about that movement that's inspired by the spindle whirl as well. This work is called Northern Lights, and it's a print that was made in 2018. So I have to say that Susan Point has won so many awards. She has earned so many awards, and I'll list a few here. In 2000, she won an honorary doctorate in fine arts from the University of Victoria. In 2004, she was appointed to the Royal Academy of Art. In 2006, she was appointed Officer of the Order of Canada, a very high honor in Canada. Honorary doctorate by Simon Fraser University, Emily Carr University, the University of BC. In 2012, the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Medal. 2018, she was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award for contribution to First Nations culture. And she was also awarded the Audain Prize for Lifetime Achievement in the Visual Arts in 2018. Wow. So her son Thomas describes that in the early days, my mom's career as an artist, it was neither her goal nor her intention to become celebrated and have her work recognized. She was simply learning to express herself. Now countless generations will be trying to emulate the body of work that she has created. So I hope this session will help you next time you see an Indigenous carving. You can look for those Coast Salish elements so you can learn a little bit more about where that carving comes from. It's a marker of Coast Salish presence on the land for thousands and thousands of years. Now what we're going to do in just a minute, we're going to think about how we can take inspiration from Susan Point's emphasis on the cycle of life. You notice so many different ways that she's showing us that movement and motion and cycle of life. And we're going to think about how we can make prints to express our own connections to nature and growth and cycles of life. So I don't use Coast Salish design elements because I'm not a Coast Salish person. And Coast Salish design elements are used to express ancestral knowledge. So I'll be creating my own design inspired to my own inspiration of nature. I want to show you before we take a look at the video, I'm going to show you the video really quickly. To create a print in the way that I am going to, you need some kind of thick paper. You need some markers, make sure they're washable markers, and you're going to need some upcycled styrofoam. When I say upcycled, we want to reuse this material. This is not garbage. When we create with art materials, we want to think, again, it's about interconnection, right? If we throw things in the garbage, it's going to impact the environment around us. So when we create our printing plate out of styrofoam, you can use it again and again and again and again. And then also that plate becomes an artwork on its own. So even with your markers, you want to use them as much as you can. So shall we take a quick look at the video of how we can create our own prints? So I wanted to think about what represented kind of growth to me. I'm from Ontario, so in Ontario there's a lot of oak trees. So I was thinking of oak leaves and acorns. Acorns kind of resembling seed planted and growth. So what I did is I'm sketching this on a scrap piece of paper, and then I'm going to go over it with a marker just so it's nice and dark. I can really see those lines, because what I'm going to do next is take my styrofoam piece, I've cut it to the same size, and put it underneath my design. And then I'm going to go over it again to kind of create an imprint into that styrofoam. I want to make sure that I'm pushing just hard enough to create an imprint, but not so hard that it kind of rips and tears the paper. I'm going to decide, do I need to cover each and every one line? Now I see, okay, I need a little bit more of an imprint here. So I'm going to go over it directly onto the styrofoam with my pencil. If you really want to, you can draw right onto styrofoam with your pencil, but every single line you make is going to show up in your print. So now I'm going to add some color. Like I mentioned before, you're going to be able to recolor this plate over and over and over again and reuse it again and again. I'm experimenting with blending some greens together, as you can see, blending some oranges into the browns. And then what I'm going to do after I've colored this in, I'm going to create my print by wetting paper. So the ink is going to transfer to the paper because of the water and the washable markers. But I need to make sure I don't have too much water, or that I have just enough water so that the colors actually show up. So let's take a look at this first try. I'm going to make sure when I push it down that I get all of kind of like the corners and edges. Aha. So my colors aren't too bold there. You can see a little bit of the lines, but not enough water. Let's try this next one. Aha, it's kind of starting to bleed and blur too much, so too much water. And then on this third try, I could probably even try again to get it more and more precise. But you can kind of see the colors are nice and bold, so I use just the right enough amount of water, maybe even a little bit too much, but I'm still learning and experimenting. But what I like about this is you can see those that negative space that creates the lines and the shapes. And you can see how someone asked about hanging the tadpole work in different directions. I'm kind of printing in lots of different directions. So again, I kind of tried to think of using lines that give the sense of a movement and cycle of growth. So that was a lot of information to take in, everybody, wasn't it? Anyep is wondering, will this webinar be available publicly afterwards? It will, absolutely. So if you missed any of the parts, it will be available on the Vancouver Art Gallery's YouTube. And if you go to our website, you can see where you can find that. You know, you can also email me with any questions that you have following up after this session, or you can even do your own prints and you can send me the images so we can share them through the Vancouver Art Gallery's community. And I can even put my email right here in the chat. So Isabel's asking, do you add the water to the paper or spray it onto the styrofoam? So I used a sponge. Oh, I should have been more clear about that. I used a sponge to add water straight to the, to add it right onto the water. So you have just the marker on the styrofoam. And it takes a little bit of experimenting, like you saw that I did. So if anyone has any other questions or comments, feel free to type them in. Again, we're very, very thankful that you could join us today. I'm very thankful that Celia, you could be here with us today. Thank you so much for your ideas and enthusiasm. And I want to say that, you know what, the gallery is open again. So when you're ready, you can come and visit by pre-booking your ticket. The website will offer some information on practices that have been put in place to ensure the safety of all of us. I'm going to put my email for any feedback that you might have, or questions continuing on, or information you'd like updated here. And we're going to say one final thank you to everybody. And thank you for spending your time with us. And keep using art as a way to connect to the world around you and to each other. Thank you all for attending. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.